Richmond, Virginia, Tuesday, October 14th, 6:27 in the evening. Get on the floor, Rebecca. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. That was always the worst sign. Sarah Mitchell pressed both hands flat over her swollen belly, 7 months pregnant, and lowered herself to the hardwood floor. Her knees shook. Her jaw locked shut. She started counting. 1, 2, 3. The baby kicked at 7. Keep counting, Sarah. Just keep counting. 40, 45, 50. Daniel straightened his cuffs. His face shifted in one breath, cold to warm. Monster to man. Rick, yeah. Business dinner. Be there in 10, he laughed. Like nothing had happened. Because for him, nothing had. The front door closed. Sarah lay on the hardwood floor, hand pressed against her daughter, and she looked up at the corner of the ceiling. A small red light blinked back at her. The nanny cam. His camera. It had seen every single second. And by morning, it would be in the hands of Colonel James Calloway, her father, a decorated Marine. 30 years of combat. A man who had spent his entire career learning how to destroy things that needed to be destroyed. If you think you already know how this ends, stay with me. Because you don't. I want to start with the morning after. Not the night, not the belt, not the sound it made, that specific crack of leather against skin that I still hear sometimes when the house gets too quiet. I do not want to start there, because everyone always starts there. Every story about women like me begins with the worst moment, the most violent moment, as if the violence is the only thing worth understanding. But the violence was never the hardest part. The hardest part was the morning after. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning where the light comes in sideways through the kitchen curtains and makes everything look warm, almost golden, like a photograph from a life you actually wanted. I made coffee. Daniel's coffee, the way he liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, exactly 240 milliliters in the blue mug he brought back from a conference in Seattle. I set it on the counter at 6:45, exactly when he came downstairs, exactly on schedule, because being on schedule was one of the ways I kept myself safe. He straightened his tie in the hallway mirror. He picked up the mug. He took a sip. Then he said, "Good morning," and kissed me on the forehead. And I smiled. That is the part nobody talks about. That smile. How automatic it was. How convincing. How I stood there in our beautiful kitchen in our beautiful house in Richmond, Virginia, with 50 marks on my body that I had not yet looked at. And I smiled at the man who put them there, because smiling was the thing that kept the morning from becoming another night. He left for work at 7:15. I watched his car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window. When the car disappeared around the corner, I put both hands flat on the counter and I breathed. Just breathed. My daughter kicked inside me. She had been kicking since 3 in the morning. I think she knew. I think babies always know. I said out loud to no one. To the kitchen. To the morning light. Okay? We are going to be okay. I did not believe it yet. But I said it anyway, because saying a thing is the first step toward making it true. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was 28 years old that October morning, 7 months pregnant, standing in a kitchen that looked like a magazine spread and felt like a prison. I had been married to Daniel Hargrove for 2 years and 4 months. I had been afraid of him for most of that time, and I had told no one, not my best friend Kate, who lived 20 minutes away and would have driven over in the middle of the night, no questions asked, if I had ever picked up the phone. Not my mother Linda, who sat across from Daniel at every holiday dinner and called him a gift, called me lucky, called our marriage the thing she always hoped I would find. And not my father, especially not my father. Colonel James Calloway, United States Marine Corps, retired. 30 years of service, 2 Purple Hearts. A man who had walked into rooms where people were trying to kill him and walked back out again. A man who had never, in 58 years on this earth, failed to protect the people he loved. I could not let him know I needed protecting, because needing protecting meant admitting what my life had become. And admitting what my life had become meant looking directly at something I had spent 18 months teaching myself not to see. So that Tuesday morning, I smiled at the man who hurt me. I watched him drive away. And I stood in the kitchen counting my breaths. I count things when I am afraid. It is something I have done since I was a child. My therapist, years later, would tell me it is a grounding technique. My brain searching for something stable and measurable when everything else feels like it is falling. 1, 2, 3, 4. The number of seconds between breaths. The number of tiles on the kitchen floor. The number of steps from the counter to the sink. The number of times a belt can strike a body in 10 minutes. 50. The answer was 50. I know, because I counted. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I was not a weak woman. I was not naive. or simple, or someone who could not take care of herself. I had a college degree. I had been teaching third grade for 4 years before Daniel asked me to stop. I could change a tire, read a balance sheet, and bake a lemon layer cake from scratch that made grown men emotional. I was not weak. I was in love with someone who had studied, very carefully, how to make strong women feel small, and he was exceptionally good at it. But here is the thing about the morning after. The thing I did not know yet, standing in that kitchen, was that the night before had already changed everything. Because the night before, something had happened that Daniel had not planned for. Something small, blinking, red, a camera. He installed it himself. For security, he said, so we could monitor the nursery from our phones when the baby arrived. The camera was recording everything, all 50. And by the time his coffee mug was sitting empty on the counter and his car was 3 miles away, the footage had already been backed up to 3 separate email accounts. Not by him, by me. With shaking hands, at 2:30 in the morning, crouched on the bathroom floor in wet clothes. I had sent that video to every email address I had ever owned. I did not know yet what I was going to do with it, but I knew I was not going to let him take it back. This is the story of how I got out. It is not a simple story. It is not a straight line from victim to survivor. There are moments in this story where I wanted to disappear completely, change my name, move somewhere Daniel would never find me, and never speak about any of it again. There are moments where the legal system felt like another weapon being used against me. There are moments where the people I trusted most said and did things that broke me open in ways the belt never did. But it is also the story of the people who refused to let me fall. A doctor who saw through my silence before I said a single word. A detective who asked hard questions without flinching at the answers. A lawyer who worked through the night to protect me from a man with more money and more connections and more practice at this than anyone should ever have. And my father, who had missed the signs, who had handed me to a monster at the altar with his blessing and his tears, and who spent every day after learning the truth doing the only thing a Marine knows how to do when the mission goes wrong. He adapted. He strategized. He dismantled Daniel Hargrove piece by careful piece, legally, permanently, completely. But before I tell you any of that, I need to take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning is where the lessons are. The beginning is where every woman watching this might recognize something. A moment, a choice, a sentence someone said that sounded like love but landed wrong. The beginning is where Daniel Hargrove seemed, to every single person who knew him, like the best thing that had ever happened to me. Daniel Hargrove was the kind of man who remembered things, not big things, small things, the specific things that make a woman feel seen. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk and not regular milk because I had mentioned it exactly once, in passing, 3 weeks before our first official date. He remembered that my favorite flower was a ranunculus and not a rose, and that I thought the distinction mattered. He remembered the name of my third-grade homeroom teacher from a story I told him once about a paper-mâche volcano project that went catastrophically wrong. I have since learned that this is a skill, a practiced, deliberate skill that certain men develop the way others develop a golf swing or a poker face. It is called mirroring. It is the art of making someone feel so completely understood that they stop asking whether they should trust you and simply begin to. But I did not know that then. I knew that Daniel Hargrove sat across from me at a restaurant in Northern Virginia on our 4th date and said, "Tell me something nobody else knows about you." And he listened to my answer like it was the most important thing he had ever heard. I knew that when he reached across the table and covered my hand with his, I felt safe in a way I had forgotten to want. We met in September. We were engaged by the following April. My mother cried happy tears when I called to tell her. My father drove 6 hours from his house in Fredericksburg to take us both to dinner and shake Daniel's hand across a white tablecloth. I remember watching my father look at Daniel that night. Jim Calloway had spent 30 years reading men. He had sat across from generals and insurgents and commanding officers of every moral caliber. He knew things about people that they had never told him. And he looked at Daniel Hargrove for a long moment. And then he nodded. He approved. I have never seen my father struggle with anything the way he later struggled with that memory. The wedding was in June. 212 people. Daniel's colleagues, his college friends, his church community, his golf partners, his business contacts. They were all there, and they all loved him. That was the thing I kept coming back to. In the months after the wedding, when things started to change, so many people loved him. His coworkers called him a mentor. His pastor called him a pillar. His college roommate gave a toast about what a loyal and generous friend he was, and half the room was genuinely moved. You cannot be a monster, I told myself. If this many people love you, I was wrong about that. But it took me 18 months to understand why. The first incident happened 6 months after the wedding. We were at a dinner party hosted by one of Daniel's colleagues, a man named Roger, whom I had met twice and did not particularly like. Roger had made a joke about one of Daniel's sales strategies, not a cruel joke, the kind of gentle ribbing that passes between colleagues at a Friday evening dinner party, and I had laughed. Not at Daniel. Not to embarrass him. I laughed because the joke was mildly funny, and laughing is a normal human response to mildly funny jokes. In the car on the way home, Daniel said nothing for 11 minutes. I counted. When we got inside, he closed the front door behind us and stood in the hallway. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the detail I would come to understand later. The detail that separated what Daniel did from the version of abuse I had been taught to recognize. He said, "You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues." I said, "Daniel, I was just laughing at Rogers. Do not do that again." And then he walked upstairs. I stood in the hallway for a long time. My heart was beating too fast. My palms were cold. I could not have explained to you, in that moment, exactly why those 4 words had done what they did to my nervous system. He had not threatened me. He had not touched me. He had simply said 4 words in a tone of voice so flat and so final that my body understood something my mind was not yet ready to accept. The something was, I was afraid of my husband. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself it was stress. The first year of marriage is difficult. My mother had said, "You are both adjusting. Give it time. Give each other grace." So I gave it grace. That was my first real mistake. Not marrying him that I cannot fully own. Because Daniel Hargrove was designed to be undetectable. But staying silent that night, chalking it up to adjustment, deciding it was nothing that was the first brick in a wall, he spent the next 18 months building around me. If you are listening to this and something in your stomach just moved, I need you to hear me say this directly. The moment your body registers fear in response to your partner's voice, that is information, not an overreaction, not sensitivity, information. Your nervous system is doing its job. Please let it. Over the following months, the changes were so gradual that I kept believing, each time, that I had finally reached the bottom, that whatever this was, we were through the worst of it. He suggested I was too stressed to keep teaching. I quit my job. He started reviewing my text messages, casually, the way you might glance at someone's screen in a movie theater. Just curious, just close, but always there. He switched all our bank accounts to paperless, all statements to his email. He gave me a credit card with a limit and asked me to let him know when I spent more than $50 on anything so he could help us stay on budget. My friend Kate stopped getting invited to things. Daniel found her energy draining too loud, too much. I started canceling plans with her, always with a good reason, always with the sincere intention of rescheduling. We stopped rescheduling. My father called every week. By month 8 of the marriage, I had learned to answer his calls in a specific way. Bright voice, short sentences. "I am fine. Dad, the baby's great. Daniel is great. Everything is great. Love you. I have to go." I got very good at those calls. My father, who had spent 30 years reading men in high-stakes environments, heard something in my voice that he did not have a word for. He would tell me later that he lay awake the night of one of those calls, staring at the ceiling of his house in Fredericksburg, with the specific feeling he used to get in the field when something was wrong and he could not yet see what it was. He got up at 2 in the morning and opened his laptop. He typed Daniel Hargrove's name into a search bar. He told himself he was just checking, just a father looking in on his daughter's husband. Nothing serious. He told himself that for about 4 minutes, and then his training took over. The record on Daniel Hargrove was, on the surface, clean. My father sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything he could find. Yale MBA, Senior VP of Pharmaceutical Sales at a mid-sized company with a strong regional reputation. Church deacon, volunteer youth baseball coach for 3 years in his mid-20s. No criminal record, no civil judgments, no public complaints. His social media was perfectly curated. Photographs with perfect lighting. Captions that mentioned gratitude, community, family. He had 200 posts over 4 years. And in each one, Daniel Hargrove was the version of himself that he wanted the world to see. Warm, successful, beloved. My father, who had spent a career understanding that the most dangerous people are often the most convincingly likable, made a note on his legal pad, performing. Then he called a number he had not dialed in 6 years. Master Sergeant Dale Crawford answered on the second ring. They had served together for a decade. Dale had retired 3 years earlier and gone into private security consulting, which was one way of saying he knew how to find things that people did not want found. My father said, "Dale, I need a favor." Completely off the books. "Deep background check on my son-in-law." Dale said, "What are we looking for?" My father said, "I do not know yet. That is why I am asking." Dale said. Give me 48 hours. While he waited, my father did his own research. He found Daniel's college records, fraternity president, dean's list, business degree. He found employment records from 3 previous companies, all with good performance reviews and steady upward progression. He found one previous engagement, a woman named Megan Voss, broken off 2 years before Daniel met me. No explanation anywhere in the public record. He wrote Megan Voss's name on his legal pad and circled it. Then Dale called back. My father told me later that he knew from the first 2 seconds of that call that his worst instincts had been right. Dale did not say hello, he said. Colonel, sit down. 2 previous restraining orders, both filed by women who had dated Daniel, both sealed, both, according to Dale's contacts, accompanied by significant financial settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The names on the orders were Megan Voss and Allison Ward. A pattern, Dale said. The kind where someone with money and connections makes problems disappear. The kind where women get scared and stop talking. My father sat in his garage at 2 in the morning, and he thought about every phone call I had not answered, every visit I had canceled. Every time my voice had that brightness in it that was not brightness at all. He thought about the wedding. He thought about the way he had looked at Daniel across that dinner table and nodded. He thought, I missed it. I walked her right to him and I missed it. He spent 3 days tracking down Megan Voss. She lived in Seattle now, married, 2 children, and she did not answer calls from numbers she did not recognize. My father sent her a handwritten letter. His return address was his name and his rank. The letter said only that his daughter was married to Daniel Hargrove, that he was concerned for her safety, and that he would be grateful for anything Megan could share. She called back on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice, my father told me later, sounded like someone who had spent years making herself very small so that a specific memory could not find her. She told him that Daniel had seemed perfect at first, charming, attentive, the man who remembered everything. 6 months in, things began to shift. Control over her schedule, her friendships, her clothing. When she pushed back, he became physically violent, always in places that could be hidden. Never her face, always her back, her ribs, her thighs. When she filed a restraining order, his lawyers arrived within 48 hours. They offered her a settlement. She was 23 years old, alone and terrified. And she took it. My father asked, did he ever mention anything online? A forum, a group of men he communicated with. Long silence. Megan said, how do you know about that? My father did not know what that meant yet, but he wrote it down. He reached Allison Ward on the following Monday. She had changed her name legally and moved to Portland, Oregon. She called back within an hour of his voicemail, she said, without introduction. Your daughter married Daniel. My father said yes, she said. Then you need to get her out now, before he kills her. She had been hospitalized twice. Ruptured spleen the 2nd time. Internal bleeding. Daniel had told the hospital she fell down the stairs. The doctors believed him because Daniel is very good at being believed. She tried to press charges. His lawyers buried her. Character assassination. Vindictive ex-girlfriend. Mentally unstable. She signed an NDA for a settlement she used to move across the country and start again. She said one more thing before she hung up. She said, he escalates. Each woman gets it worse than the last. And he is most dangerous when a woman is pregnant. That is when his need for control is absolute. My father ended that call. He sat in his garage and he did not move for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and he started building a file. Because my father is a Marine, and Marines do not panic. They gather intelligence. They assess. They plan. And then they act with everything they have at exactly the right moment. He needed one more thing. He needed current evidence. He needed proof of what was happening right now, inside that beautiful house, to his daughter. He did not yet know that 50 miles away, at that exact moment, I was lying on a bathroom floor in wet clothes, watching a red light blink in the corner of my ceiling. He did not know that I was already saving us. Meanwhile, in those same weeks, the changes in my daily life had become so complete that I could no longer see them clearly. That is what isolation does. It does not announce itself. It arrives slowly, in reasonable-sounding increments, until one day you look around and realize that the only person in your entire life whose opinion you have regular access to is the person who controls all the exits. I had no job. I had no independent income. My name was not on the house. My trust fund, left to me by my grandmother, had been quietly absorbed into a joint account that Daniel managed. My best friend had drifted away. My parents lived 6 hours from regular visits. I want you to hear this part carefully, because I think it is the part that people misunderstand most about situations like mine. I did not feel trapped in the way you might imagine. I did not feel like a prisoner. I felt like someone who had made a series of reasonable compromises for the sake of a marriage, for the sake of a coming baby, for the sake of keeping the peace with a man who was, on most days, perfectly pleasant as long as everything went the way he wanted. The trap does not feel like a trap while you are walking into it. It only feels like a trap when you try to walk out. The night of October 14th began as a Tuesday evening. Daniel came home at 6:17. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock since 5:45, doing the specific mental math that had become as automatic as breathing. Is the food ready? Is the table set? Is the kitchen clean? Is everything in its right place? Have I thought of every possible thing that might go wrong? The pot roast was supposed to be ready at 6. It was not ready at 6. I had misjudged the cooking time by 17 minutes. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway. He set down his briefcase. He looked at the oven. He looked at me. He said, "What time is it?" "Sarah," I said. "Daniel, I'm sorry. The roast needs another." "What time is it?" 6:17. "And what time was dinner supposed to be ready?" "I know. I'm sorry. The cooking time was different," and I go upstairs. Those two words, said calmly, said quietly, in the way that was worse than yelling. Because yelling means losing control, and Daniel never lost control. Control was the point. Control was always the point. I went upstairs. I want to stop here and tell you something that I think is important. When Daniel was quiet like that, I knew what was coming. I had learned the difference between the versions of him. When he raised his voice, it was almost always about small things. Status displays for an audience that was not there. But when he was quiet and controlled like he was that Tuesday evening, that was when he was truly dangerous. The cold version of him was never impulsive. It was always deliberate. I have since learned that this pattern, the controlled, premeditated nature of the violence, is actually a clinical marker. It is not a man who lost his temper. It is a man who decided. There is a profound difference, legally and psychologically, and I want you to understand it. I stood in our bedroom. The sun was setting outside the window. The room was beautiful. The same room I had seen on a Pinterest board once and shown to Daniel, saying this is the room I always imagined for us. And he had built it for me. Renovation from scratch. Marble floors. Rainfall shower. Pendant lights over the dresser. He gave me everything I asked for except the thing that mattered most. He came into the bedroom. He stood at the closet. He took off his suit jacket, hung it carefully, and then he removed his belt. The leather one, dark brown. His dress belt. He said, "Get on the floor." I got on the floor. I will not describe the next 10 minutes in detail. Not because I am trying to protect you from it, but because the details are not the point. The count is the point. The fact that it was counted is the point. I started at 1 because numbers feel stable when nothing else does. I counted because counting meant there was a bottom, a place where the number stopped. And I told myself that wherever the bottom was, I could make it there if I just kept counting. The number was 50. 50 times. He put his belt back on the rack, between his ties. His phone rang. He answered it in the hallway. His voice transformed in the space of 1 second warm, easy, the voice everyone else always heard. He told whoever was calling that he would be there in 10 minutes. He laughed at something they said. Then I heard his car leave the driveway. I lay on the bedroom floor for a long time. The baby kicked. First at 7, hard and insistent. Then at 20. Then something gentler at 38, like a question, like she was asking whether I was still there. "I am still here," I said, to the floor, to her. I pushed myself up, made it to the bathroom, turned on the shower, then changed my mind. I needed to be still. I needed the tub. I climbed in with all my clothes on. Maternity dress, cardigan, even my shoes. I turned on the cold water because in that specific kind of shock, cold water is the only thing that feels real. I watched the water pool around me and turned from clear to faintly pink where it touched my skin. I was bleeding somewhere. I did not know where. And in that moment, I did not have the bandwidth to care. I was staring at the ceiling when I saw it. The blinking red light, small, in the corner. The nanny cam that Daniel installed 8 weeks ago. "For security," he said, "so we can watch the nursery from our phones. Smart home technology. Peace of mind." My heart stopped. Then it started again faster. The camera had been recording. I climbed out of that bathtub, water streaming off my clothes, soaking the heated floor. I grabbed my phone with both hands and opened the nanny cam application. There it was. Time-stamped, dated, saved automatically to the cloud account Daniel set up under his name. His cloud account, which I had the password to because I managed the household accounts. I sat on the bathroom floor and I watched myself on that small screen and I thought, this is real. This is what actually happened. I am not crazy. I am not exaggerating. This is irrefutable. Then I did something that, looking back, is the most important thing I have ever done in my life. Before I called anyone, before I cried, before I even tried to figure out what came next, I opened my email and I sent that video to every account I had ever owned. My regular email, my old school teaching email, the Hotmail account I made in college that I could barely remember the password for. 3 separate locations, 3 separate servers, all time-stamped, all backed up. None of them accessible to Daniel without passwords he did not have. He could delete his cloud account. He could destroy his phone, his laptop, every device in the house. He could not take back what I had already sent. I sat on that floor for a long time afterward, phone in my hand, water drying in the fabric of my cardigan. Then I opened my contacts. I looked at 3 names. My mother, Linda. My friend, Kate. My father, Dad. Colonel James Calloway. I had a memory, suddenly, of being 9 years old and falling off my bike on our driveway, bleeding on his shirt while he held me, telling me that pain is temporary and brave is forever. I almost called him. My finger hovered there, and then Daniel's voice played in my head. The specific sentence he had said to me perhaps 100 times in 2 years, in different variations, but always the same message. If you tell anyone, I will make sure everyone knows the truth about you. What a failure you are. How you drove me to this. Your father will be ashamed of you. I put the phone down, but I picked it up again, and I called my doctor. Claire Holt had been my OB/GYN for 3 years. She was 44 years old, auburn hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of doctor who sat down during appointments and looked at you while she talked, not at the chart. She had walked me through my first ultrasound. She had held my hand when we heard the heartbeat for the first time. This woman and I, in a room smelling of lavender disinfectant, both of us quietly moved by the specific miracle of a sound. I called her office at 7:40 that evening. I asked to be seen the following morning. The receptionist offered me 9:30. Yes, I said. Thank you. I lay in the bathtub a while longer. Then I went to the guest room and I locked the door, which Daniel did not know I had learned to do. And I lay on top of the covers in my damp clothes and I did not sleep. The next morning I put on the loosest clothes I owned, a maternity dress that came to my knees, a cardigan that covered my arms and most of my upper back, dark colors. I drove myself to the appointment because Daniel was already at work and because I had not yet decided what I was going to say. I sat in the waiting room among the watercolor paintings of mothers and babies, among the smell of vanilla and lavender, among other women in various stages of expecting, and I felt like I was wearing a disguise, like the outside of me and the inside of me were entirely different people. The nurse called my name and brought me to an examination room when Dr. Holt came in. She glanced at my chart. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at the chart. She said, "This is listed as a routine checkup." Yes, I said. I just wanted to make sure the baby was okay. She took my blood pressure first. The machine gave its reading and she was quiet for a moment. 150/95, she said. That is significantly higher than your baseline, Sarah. I have been stressed, I said. Pregnancy stress. She made a note. She listened to the baby's heartbeat. Strong, she said. Active. Then she said she needed to listen to my lungs. And could I lean forward? I leaned forward. The examination gown gaped at the back, Doctor. Holt's hands went still. There was a silence in that room that stretched for several seconds, and I have never in my life felt so exposed and so seen at the same time. She said, "Sarah, I need you to look at me." I turned around. I met her eyes. She said, "What happened to your back?" I had prepared an answer. I had rehearsed it the previous night. I fell. The stairs are steep. I have been so clumsy lately with the pregnancy. I am so embarrassed. Honestly, none of those words came out. Instead, for the first time in 2 years, I told the truth. My husband beat me last night, I said, with his belt. I counted. It was 50 times. The words hung in the air between us. Real, undeniable, said out loud for the first time in my life. Dr. Holt's face did not change. No shock, no pity, no judgment. Just steady, professional, absolute attention. She asked how long it had been happening. 18 months, I said. She asked if he had ever struck my abdomen. No, I said. He is always very careful about where he leaves marks. She asked if anyone else knew. I said no one. She handed me a tissue. Then she told me something that cracked something open in my chest. She said, "What you just described is not your fault. It is not because you are a terrible wife. It is because your husband is abusive. And what he did last night was not discipline. It was not anger. It was attempted murder." She went to the door. She opened it slightly and spoke to someone in the hallway. Then she said, "Sarah, I am a mandatory reporter. I called the police before I came into this room. I saw the marks through your gown while you were sitting in the chair. Panic rose so fast in my chest that I could not speak. When he finds out, I finally managed. He will kill me." Dr. Holt knelt in front of me. She took both my hands. She said, "I know, And that is exactly why Detective Monroe is here. We have a protocol for this. You are not alone in this room anymore. A woman appeared in the doorway. 39 years old, dark hair, a detective's badge on her belt. She introduced herself as Lisa Monroe, domestic violence specialist, 15 years. She sat down. She looked at me directly. Without flinching, she said, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about one thing. Evidence like yours should be a strong case. But strong cases fall apart 70% of the time when victims go home and change their minds. I am not judging you, it is the most understandable thing in the world. But I need to know right now, are you ready to not go home? I looked at her. I looked at Dr. Holt. Two women offering me something I had not had in 2 years. Belief, I said. I have video. From a nanny cam. It recorded everything. Detective Monroe pulled her chair forward. She said, show me. I opened my email. I clicked the file. I handed her my phone. She watched for 2 minutes. Then she stopped. Set the phone down carefully, she said. Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to send this to my official email right now. And then I need you to call your father. I said, my father. She said, he is already on his way. I stared at her. She said, he contacted me 6 weeks ago. Sarah. He had concerns about your husband and he wanted help building a case. We have been working together. He did not tell you because he did not want to put you in a position of having to lie to Daniel about what your father knew. The room swam for a moment. Then the door opened, and my father walked in. He said, hey, Bug, the nickname he had not used since I was 9 years old. I was standing and moving before I had decided to move. His arms went around me, and I buried my face in his shoulder, and I sobbed in a way I had not allowed myself to sob in 2 years. Not quiet crying, not controlled, safe, silent tears. Real crying, the kind that comes from the bottom of everything. He held me. This man who had served in 3 theaters of combat and never wavered. He held me, and his voice was wrecked when he said, I have got you. I have got you now. I am not letting go. While Sarah was safe in Detective Monroe's care, Jim Calloway was already 3 moves ahead. He sat down with Detective Monroe and attorney Ryan Pierce, a family law specialist and former JAG officer whom Jim had contacted 3 weeks earlier, and they laid out the plan with military precision. Daniel was currently away on a so-called business trip to Chicago. Dale Crawford had already confirmed it was not a business trip. It was a long weekend at a resort in the Virginia mountains with a 24-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative named Jessica. He would be gone for 72 hours. 72 hours was enough. Ryan filed for emergency protective order, emergency asset freeze, emergency sole custody petition for the unborn child, emergency divorce proceedings. Everything filed simultaneously, everything hitting at once. Detective Monroe had been building the evidentiary foundation for 6 weeks. She had statements from Megan Voss and Allison Ward, both of whom had agreed, after Jim's outreach, to cooperate formally with law enforcement. She had financial records showing the pattern of economic control. She had audio recordings from the country club where Daniel socialized a friend of Jim's who sat on the club's board of directors, had provided security footage with audio. And several conversations captured Daniel in casual conversation describing his marriage in terms that were prosecutable. But the video was the centerpiece. 90 minutes of time stamped, cloud-backed footage, irrefutable. The morning after Sarah was safe at her parents' home, they arrived at the house Daniel owned. Jim drove. Ryan followed in his sedan. Detective Monroe came in an unmarked car. Sarah's college friend Kate Brennan, who had driven through the night the moment Sarah called her, brought a moving truck. The house stood quiet and perfect in the October morning. Expensive landscaping, freshly painted shutters, a wreath on the front door that Sarah had made herself from dried flowers. It looked like the kind of house where nothing bad could possibly happen. Kate looked at it and said, simply, I am going to help you rob this place blind. Legally, but thoroughly. They moved through the rooms with lists and boxes. Sarah's clothing, her grandmother's china, packed in newspaper, her books, her teaching materials, the childhood photographs she had brought from her parents' house when she moved in, the nursery soft yellow walls, white furniture, a handmade mobile. They took it all apart, labeled every piece, loaded it with care. In the nursery closet, Kate found the boxes of baby clothes Sarah had spent 6 months collecting. She packed them without a word, but her jaw was tight the whole time. Then Sarah went to Daniel's office. She was not supposed to go in there. It was his private space. The one room in the house she had learned not to enter without permission. She opened the door anyway. His laptop sat open on the desk, unlocked, screen active. She sat down. The file structure was organized, labeled, alphabetical, the way Daniel organized everything. One folder label stopped her cold. The folder was called Training. Clicked it. Photographs filled the screen. Hundreds of them. Sarah asleep. Sarah in the shower, visible through a door he had left ajar. Sarah in the kitchen, unaware. Sarah changing clothes in the bedroom. 2 years' worth of photographs she had never known existed. Secret cameras beyond the nanny cam, hidden in light fixtures, behind picture frames, inside an air vent she had walked past 1,000 times. Her stomach lurched. Detective Monroe appeared behind her. Sarah pointed at the screen and said, "What is this?" Monroe looked for a long moment. Her expression hardened. She said, "This is illegal surveillance. Do not touch anything else." She called for gloves and an evidence kit. Then Jim opened a second folder. Forum posts. A private online forum. Not dark web, but deliberately obscured. The username, Dan H. Richmond. 847 posts spanning 4 years. Before Sarah. During their courtship. During the marriage. Men sharing what they called household management strategies. Punishment frameworks. Isolation timelines. Compliance metrics. Daniel had not stumbled into violence. He had studied it. He had researched and refined, and compared notes with dozens of other men who were doing the same thing to their own families. But that was not the most devastating part. Jim scrolled to a post dated 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks ago exactly. The post read, "Wife found the camera. She backed up footage. I have retained the analyst. This is manageable." He had known she would find the camera. He had prepared for it. He had anticipated her escape route and built a counterattack before she had even made her move. Detective Monroe read the post twice. Then she looked at Jim. She said he was not careless. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she would run, and he had a plan for when she did. Jim looked at the screen for a long time. Then he copied every file, every folder, every post to an evidence drive. He said quietly, "Not anymore." The legal process, Sarah had been told, was strong, ironclad, Ryan said. As clear a case as he had seen in 20 years. She believed him for exactly 4 days. Then Daniel's attorney made his first move. Warren Cole was 55 years old, silver-haired, and had been making legal problems disappear for wealthy men for 3 decades. He filed an emergency motion on a Thursday afternoon. Attached to it was an affidavit from a forensic video analyst who claimed that the nanny cam footage showed evidence of digital manipulation, timestamp irregularities, possible frame rate editing. The analyst claimed the footage may have been altered before being submitted as evidence. Ryan called Jim immediately. His voice was carefully controlled. He said the asset freeze is being challenged. The criminal charges need additional corroboration before the DA can proceed confidently. The judge will not risk a wrongful conviction on contested evidence. Sarah was in her childhood bedroom when her father came in and told her. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. She said, "I backed up that video at 2:30 in the morning before I called anyone. I did not alter anything. I did not even know what frame rates were." Jim said, "I know." She said, "He is going to pay someone to say it is fake." Jim said, "We are going to prove it is real. Give me time." Time felt like a thing she did not have. But the first catastrophe had not yet arrived. The first catastrophe was the deposition. Warren Cole deposed Sarah for 4 hours in Ryan Pierce's conference room. A court reporter typed everything. A recording device sat on the table. Cole was methodical, surgical, unhurried. He established that Sarah had quit her job voluntarily, that she had never sought medical attention for any previous injuries, that she had full access to the household account at all times if she chose to use it, that the pregnancy had not been formally planned, that her father had expressed no concerns about the marriage before the incident. He asked, in a tone of complete reasonableness, whether it was possible she had misremembered the sequence of events given the extreme stress of late-term pregnancy. He asked whether it was possible the footage had been edited after the fact by someone with technical knowledge, perhaps someone she had confided in before formally reporting. He asked whether she was aware that Daniel had spent significant personal funds on therapy referrals and couples counseling materials in the months before the incident, which he characterized as evidence of a man trying to save a marriage. By hour 3, Sarah's hands were flat on the table to keep them still. Ryan objected repeatedly. Cole overrode with legal precision and a patient smile. When it was over, Ryan drove Sarah home. She sat in the passenger seat for several minutes without speaking. She said, "He made me sound like I invented it." Ryan said, "I know," she said. "What if the jury believes him instead of me?" Ryan started to answer. In that pause, that fraction of a second before he found the right words, Sarah understood something about the legal system that no one had ever prepared her for. Evidence does not speak for itself. Evidence requires a narrative. And the man who had spent 2 years rehearsing this scenario had hired someone very skilled at rewriting narratives. Engagement point 1 Universal Dilemma. If you have ever sat across from someone who had the power to make the truth sound like a lie, you know what that 4 hours felt like. You know the specific, nauseating helplessness of being absolutely certain of your own experience and watching someone dismantle it sentence by careful sentence. That night, Sarah woke at 2 in the morning with a contraction so sharp it took her breath. Then another, 3 minutes later. Then another, 2 minutes. 36 weeks pregnant. 4 weeks early. Diane called the hospital. Jim drove. Sarah sat in the back seat, breathing through contractions that were coming too fast, too close. And she held her stomach with both hands. She said, "Dad, if something happens tonight." The video is backed up to 3 emails. The passwords are in the blue notebook in your desk drawer. Promise me you will finish this. Jim's hands tightened on the wheel. He said, "Nothing is going to happen to you." She said, "Promise me anyway." He said, "I promise." They arrived at the hospital at 3:15. Emergency admission. Dr. Holt was called in from home. She arrived still in pajamas under her white coat, and the sight of her was, Sarah would later say, the first thing in 48 hours that felt like solid ground. Emergency C-section. Fetal heart rate dropping. "We need to move now." They wheeled Sarah into surgery. Jim and Diane sat in the hallway outside. Diane held Jim's hand. He let her. He did not move, did not speak. Just sat with the stillness of a man who had learned to wait in impossible circumstances and had never once found it easy. 20 minutes later, there was a sound from behind the surgical suite doors, a cry. Small, furious. Alive, Jim closed his eyes. He did not hear the lobby radio crackle. He did not hear the security guard's voice at first. Then one phrase broke through. "Sir, there is a man at the entrance claiming to be the patient's husband." Jim was on his feet before the sentence ended. Daniel Hargrove stood at the security desk in the hospital lobby. Suit and tie at 4 in the morning. Charm fully deployed. Speaking to the guard in the warm voice everyone trusted, he said, "That is my child being born in this hospital. I have every right to be here." Jim walked into the lobby and stood between Daniel and the hallway that led to the surgical suite. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch him. He said, "There are 2 officers on their way right now. You have approximately 3 minutes. So I am going to use those 3 minutes to tell you something important." Daniel said, "Jim, let us be adults here." Jim said, "I know about Caroline Whitfield. I know about Megan Voss. I know about Allison Ward. I know about the forum. I know about the analyst you retained before Sarah even found the camera. I know about every single thing you built, and I have been taking it apart for 8 weeks." Daniel's charming expression did not disappear, but something behind it did. Something went away that did not come back. Jim said, "You built something very careful over a very long time. I spent 30 years dismantling things that were built carefully. It is, honestly, the only thing I am truly good at." 2 officers came through the entrance. They arrested Daniel Hargrove for violation of a protective order on hospital security cameras, with a newborn daughter crying 30 meters away. Her name was Claire Calloway Mitchell, 4 pounds and 6 ounces, born at 4:22 in the morning. She was in the NICU, tiny and furious and fighting, and Sarah sat beside her isolette with one hand through the porthole touching her daughter's fingers. And she thought, "We are here. Against everything. We are here." She was given 4 days that felt almost like safety. Then the network activated. It began with phone calls, unknown numbers, Daniel's colleagues, his church community, mutual friends, neighbors, people Sarah had met at holiday parties and charity events, all delivering variations of the same message. "He made a mistake. You are overreacting. This is going to destroy a good man's life." Then it escalated. Sarah's photograph appeared on 2 separate online forums dedicated to what their members called false accusation exposure. Jim's military service record was pulled from public records and used to mock him. Kate Brennan's small graphic design business was targeted with a coordinated review bombing, 200 one-star ratings in 6 hours, each leaving identical text. And then someone posted the name of Sarah's hospital and her room number online, with a caption that read, "She and the baby are right here." The hospital security team moved Sarah to a different floor at 3 in the morning. She was transferred in a wheelchair with her IV still attached, wheeled through empty corridors, while Claire slept in the NICU 30 meters away, unaware that any of this was happening. Engagement point 2, shared experience. If you have ever felt completely alone in the middle of a fight you did not start, surrounded by people who somehow believe the person who hurt you, this is the part of the story that will land differently. Because it was not the belt that almost broke Sarah Mitchell. It was this. The coordinated, cheerful, strategic cruelty of people who had never been in that room on that October night and were absolutely certain they understood what had happened there. Sarah called Jim from the new hospital room at 1 in the morning. She was in a chair beside Claire's borrowed NICU unit, which had been moved with her. The baby was asleep. The room was quiet and institutional, and Sarah felt in that moment, like the walls were made of paper. She said, "Dad, I want to take the settlement, whatever he is offering. I want to change our names and move somewhere he cannot find us, and I never want to say any of this again." Silence on the line. Then Jim said, "Okay, just that." "Okay," Sarah said. "That is it," he said. "You have earned the right to make that choice. Nobody in the world gets to take that from you. Not Daniel, not me, not the legal system. If you want to disappear and be safe, I will pack the car tonight and drive you wherever you want to go, whatever you need." She started crying. He said, "But I need you to do one thing for me. Sleep tonight, just tonight. Because right now you are sitting in a hospital room at 1 in the morning after the worst 2 weeks of your life. And that is a terrible time to make any permanent decision. Can you sleep first and decide in the morning?" She said. "What if I make the same choice in the morning?" He said. "Then I drive the car and we do not look back." She slept. In the morning, a woman arrived at Jim and Diane's house. Patricia Hargrove, Daniel's mother. She was 61 years old, immaculate, always. She had been, in Sarah's experience, the kind of woman who ironed her casual clothing and apologized to wait staff in a tone that suggested she was the one doing them a favor. She had called Sarah twice in the previous week, and Sarah had not answered. This morning, she was not immaculate. She had driven from her home in McLean in a coat she had clearly put on over pajamas. She was carrying a cardboard box. Her eyes were swollen in the way that suggested not recent crying but days of it. She stood on Jim's doorstep and said, "I need to speak with Sarah. I know I have no right to ask, but please." Jim brought her inside. Sarah came downstairs. She sat across from Patricia in the living room, with the specific caution of a woman who had learned that the people Daniel loved were not always safe. Patricia said, "I want to tell you why. Not because it is an excuse. There is no excuse. But because I think you deserve to understand how someone becomes what my son became." She opened the box. Inside, her own medical records from a hospital in Northern Virginia, dated 26 years earlier. Photographs she had taken of herself and hidden in a safety deposit box. Old police reports she had written and then never filed. The application for a restraining order against her own husband, Daniel's father, never completed. Withdrawn at the last moment because Daniel Sr. had cried and promised, and she believed he meant it. For 19 years, Patricia said, she had stayed in a marriage exactly like the one Sarah described. She had protected her son from knowing how bad it was. She had told herself she was shielding him. She had not understood, until 72 hours ago, that she had done something else entirely. She had shown a small boy, over and over, in 1,000 small and large moments, that the person who holds the belt holds the power, that fear is a form of love, that staying when you should leave is what women do. Daniel had not invented what he did to Sarah. He had learned it, Patricia said. "I gave your names to Detective Monroe. I am prepared to testify. Everything I covered up, Caroline Whitfield's settlement, the payments I made from my personal account, every end I signed on his behalf. I will say all of it, under oath, in front of anyone who needs to hear it." Sarah looked at her for a long time. She said, "Why now? After everything?" Patricia reached into the box and took out a photograph. A NICU photograph, the kind the hospital takes in the first hours. Claire Calloway Mitchell, 4 pounds and 6 ounces, eyes closed. "Impossibly small," Patricia said, "because that baby did not choose any of this. And I have spent 30 years letting the next generation pay for choices I made. And I am done." She set the photograph on the coffee table between them. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not expect it. She simply sat there with her box of evidence and waited for Sarah to decide what to do with it. The trial began on a Monday morning in February. Claire was 4 months old. She was with Diane during court days, sleeping and eating and being entirely indifferent to the fact that her father's future was being decided 30 miles away, which Sarah thought was probably the healthiest possible attitude. The courtroom was full. Press in the gallery, domestic violence advocates, representatives from 2 nonprofit organizations, Daniel's former colleagues, some of whom had come to support him and some of whom Sarah suspected had come to see, and in the back row, sitting together, 3 women, Megan Voss, who had flown from Seattle, Allison Ward, who had driven from Portland, and Caroline Whitfield, who had driven from Charlottesville in the early morning and arrived before the building opened. Daniel sat at the defense table in a suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His hair was perfect. His expression was measured and appropriate and precisely calibrated. He looked, to anyone who did not know what to look for, like a man wrongly accused who was bearing it with dignity. Warren Cole had constructed a 3-part defense. Sarah was vindictive. Sarah was financially motivated. The video evidence was unreliable. The video evidence question had been resolved the previous week when Detective Monroe's investigation traced the forensic analyst back to the same online forum where Daniel posted. He was not an independent expert. He was a member with a username and 8 years of posts. The DA moved to exclude his testimony as fraudulent, and the judge agreed. Sarah testified first. She had prepared for this with Ryan over several evenings at his office. He had walked her through every question Cole would ask. He had shown her the transcript from the deposition, and they had worked through each answer until she could deliver it without her hands shaking. In the witness box, she was calm, not cold, not robotic. Calm the way people are calm when they have decided that the truth is the only thing they have to offer, and the truth is enough. She described the marriage, the isolation, the financial control, the first incident in the hallway, the pattern of escalation, the specific evening of October 14th. Cole cross-examined for 90 minutes. He was, as always, methodical and unhurried. He reminded the jury of the lack of prior medical documentation. He suggested financial motivation. He implied that a woman who had never sought help before was perhaps not as trapped as she claimed. Sarah answered each question directly and did not elaborate beyond what was asked and did not react to the framing. Ryan had told her, "The jury is watching how you respond to pressure. Show them that you know what you know." When Cole asked whether she had ever been diagnosed with any mood disorders, Ryan was on his feet with an objection before the sentence was complete. Then the jury watched the video. All 90 minutes. No interruptions. No narration. Just the footage. Some of them looked away. 2 cried quietly. One man in the back row pressed his hand flat over his mouth and kept it there for a long time. The judge called a recess after the footage concluded. Dr. Holt testified. Medical evidence. 50 documented injuries. Photographed the morning after. Consistent with belt strikes. Consistent with the footage. Consistent with a pattern of repeated trauma over an extended period. Detective Monroe testified. The investigation. The financial records. The forum posts. The prior victims. The hidden cameras beyond the nanny cam. The analyst's fraudulent credentials. Megan Voss testified. Quietly. Carefully. With her hands folded on the railing in front of her. Allison Ward testified. She said, at one point, almost without inflection, "The second time he hospitalized me, I thought I had misunderstood what love was supposed to feel like. I understand now that I had not misunderstood. He had deliberately taught me wrong." And then Patricia Hargrove walked to the witness box. She sat down. She looked at Daniel once. Briefly, then away. She said, "I raised my son in a home where violence was used as control. Not by me, by his father. I stayed because I loved Daniel Sr. and because I believed I could fix it, and because leaving felt impossible in ways I could not explain to people who had never been inside it. I thought I was protecting my son from the truth. I understand now that I was educating him. I was showing him, day after day, what power looks like, and what submission looks like, and which one he should want to be. I covered up what he did to Caroline Whitfield. I paid her settlement from my personal savings account. I helped his lawyers approach Megan Voss and Allison Ward. I convinced myself each time that it was a one-time event, that this version of my son was not who he truly was. I was wrong. This is who he truly was. This is who I helped create, and I will spend the rest of my life accounting for that." The courtroom was completely silent. Daniel did not look at her. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Sarah sat in a conference room with Ryan and Jim and Kate and Dr. Holt, who had rearranged her entire week to be present. They ate deli sandwiches that nobody really tasted. Kate made coffee that nobody really needed. They talked about other things when they could, and sat in silence when they could not. At 4:47 in the afternoon, the jury returned. Guilty, 47 of 50 count. The 3 acquittals were on the lesser included charges that had been contested on technical grounds. On every count that mattered, every assault. The domestic violence charges, the stalking, the voyeurism, the child endangerment. Guilty. Sarah sat very still in her chair. Then Cole stood and filed an emergency appeal. Juror misconduct, he claimed. One juror had allegedly accessed outside information mid-deliberation. The conviction was temporarily stayed pending review. Daniel stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He turned and walked out of the courtroom. He passed within 4 feet of Sarah. He did not look at her. He did not have to. That look, or the absence of it, was its own message. I am still here. I am still untouchable. This is not over. Sarah felt, in that moment, the specific devastation of a victory being taken back in real time. All the testimony, all the footage, all the months of preparation, and he was walking out of that courtroom in his perfectly tailored suit. Then she became aware of the people standing behind her. Kate, shoulder touching hers. Dr. Holt, standing very straight. Jim, completely still. The way he got still when something required absolute steadiness. And across the room, near the gallery door, three women she had never personally met: Megan Voss, Allison Ward, Caroline Whitfield, all three looking at her with the specific expression of women who had waited a very long time for this day and were not going anywhere. Daniel walked out surrounded by his lawyers. He was completely alone. 72 hours later, the appeal was denied. The judge reviewing it found the juror misconduct claim to be frivolous and unsupported by evidence. Motions denied. Appeal denied. Stay lifted. Daniel Hargrove was remanded to custody. The sentencing hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge, who had presided over domestic violence cases for 12 years and had watched every minute of the nanny cam footage, sentenced Daniel to 17 years in Virginia State Prison. Lifetime restraining order. Parental rights terminated by his own petition he had, through his lawyers, chosen to relinquish any claim to Claire rather than share custody with Sarah. Mandatory registration. Court-ordered restitution. All non-disclosure agreements signed by Caroline Whitfield, Megan Voss, and Allison Ward were voided by court order. They could speak now, all three of them, freely, forever. Sarah watched the officers lead Daniel out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She had thought she would feel triumph. She had imagined it sometimes in the worst nights, lying in her childhood bedroom listening to Claire breathe, thinking about this moment, the vindication, the validation. What she felt instead was tired, profoundly, bone-deeply tired. And then, underneath the tired, something quiet and solid and absolutely new: freedom. She recognized it because she had almost forgotten what it felt like. October again. The kind of October morning where the light comes in sideways and makes everything golden. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her apartment and drank her coffee oat milk. No sugar, her preference, not his, and watched her daughter sitting in her bouncer on the living room floor, batting at a hanging toy with the absolute concentration of a person who has decided that this specific plastic fish is the most important problem in the world. Claire was 9 months old, 5 pounds and 6 ounces the day she came home from the NICU. Now she was round-cheeked and emphatic, and had recently developed a preference for pulling her own socks off and presenting them to whoever was nearest with an expression of profound satisfaction. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, second-hand furniture, mismatched dishes, a bookshelf that was slightly too large for the wall it occupied. None of it matched. All of it was hers. Her name was on the lease, her name on the utilities, her bank account, her money, her life. She had gone back to teaching 3 months ago. Online classes, flexible schedule, enough to work around Claire's daycare hours. The salary was modest. Combined with the recovered trust fund from her grandmother, the court-ordered restitution, and the child support that Daniel's prison account would begin paying when it accumulated enough. She was stable, not wealthy, stable. That was everything. Every Wednesday evening, she drove to the community center 4 blocks from her apartment, and she set up a circle of chairs and a coffee maker and a box of tissues. And 8 women came and sat down. Some of them she had known for months. Some were new each week. They were various ages, various situations, at various points on the long and non-linear road of leaving and healing and beginning again. They did not all have video evidence. They did not all have fathers with military contacts and investigative experience. They did not all have doctors who happened to see through their gowns. Most of them had none of those things. Sarah had started the group partly because Dr. Holt had told her, 6 weeks after the trial, that 3 women had come to her office in the month of the verdict citing Sarah's case as the reason they found the courage to speak. Partly because Detective Monroe had called to say that the Forum investigation had resulted in 11 arrests across 4 states, and that 2 of the women identified as victims through that investigation had reached out asking if there was a support network, and partly because sitting in silence felt like surrender, and Sarah Mitchell had decided she was done surrendering. On a Wednesday evening in October, 11 months after the verdict, she arrived at the community center to find someone new sitting in the hallway outside the room, waiting before the door was even unlocked. A young woman, 26, maybe 27, 6 months pregnant, visible under a loose jacket. She was wearing long sleeves despite the warm evening. Sarah unlocked the door. She held it open. She said, "Come in." The young woman came in slowly, the way people enter rooms where they are not sure they are allowed to be. She sat in the chair farthest from the door. She held her bag in her lap with both hands. She looked at the circle of empty chairs with an expression that Sarah recognized the expression of someone calculating all the ways this could go wrong. Sarah set up the coffee. She arranged the chairs. She did not rush toward the woman or pepper her with questions. When the other members began to arrive, Sarah introduced herself to the group as she always did, simply, with her own name, and the fact that she was a survivor and a mother and a former third-grade teacher who had discovered that the skills required for managing 28 eight-year-olds and the skills required for running a support group were, in fact, nearly identical. People laughed. The new woman's hands loosened a little on her bag. Halfway through the meeting, the young woman raised her hand. She said, "I do not know if I belong here. I do not know if what is happening to me is bad enough to count." Engagement point 3 wisdom moment. Sarah had heard this exact sentence, or a version of it, from nearly every woman who had ever walked through that door for the first time. And she had learned, through her own experience and through 11 months of listening to other women describe theirs, that this sentence, this specific uncertainty about whether one's own suffering is sufficiently severe to count, is not a sign that a woman's situation is minor. It is a sign that someone has worked very hard to make her doubt her own experience. Sarah said, "Can I tell you something?" The young woman nodded. Sarah said, "I asked myself that same question for 18 months, whether it was bad enough, whether I was exaggerating, whether I was the problem, and every time I decided it was probably fine, it got worse. Because the question is not whether it is bad enough yet. The question is whether it should be happening at all." She said, "Nothing that makes you feel the way you are feeling right now is okay. That is the only answer you need." The young woman cried, quietly, into a tissue she had pulled from the box before Sarah had even finished the sentence. The group kept going. Stories shared. Progress noted. One woman celebrated 4 months in her own apartment. Another described calling her sister for the first time in 3 years and being answered on the first ring. After the meeting, when everyone had gone, Sarah stood at the window of the community center putting on her coat. The city outside was doing what October cities do: orange leaves on wet pavement, street lights on early. The particular quality of evening air that smells like wood smoke and possibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jim. He wrote, "How was group?" She wrote back, "Good. New woman. Pregnant. Scared." She came in. 3 dots appeared. Then, that is the work. Then, good night, bug. She smiled. She drove home. She carried Claire up from the car seat, still sleeping, warm and loose-limbed in the way only sleeping babies are. She laid her in the crib, watched her settle, touched her soft hair. She stood in the doorway of Claire's room for a moment. The room was yellow. Sarah had painted it herself, the same yellow from the nursery in the house she had left. She had decided she was not going to let Daniel Hargrove have the color yellow. It was her favorite color. She kept it in her kitchen. She made tea. She sat at her small second-hand table with her laptop open, and she pulled up the document she had been working on for 3 weeks. A first-person essay for a domestic violence advocacy organization's annual publication. Her name at the top, her photograph, her story, fully told. In her own words, edited by no one. She read back over the last paragraph she had written. She added this: "I am not sharing this because I have fully healed. Healing does not work that way, and I distrust anyone who tells you it does. I still check the locks twice sometimes. I still flinch at certain tones of voice. I still have nights where I lie awake counting things. But I am sharing this because I want you to understand what life on the other side of leaving looks like. It looks like a small apartment with mismatched dishes. It looks like a Tuesday morning where you make coffee the way you like it, not the way someone told you to. It looks like a baby who does not know what fear sounds like because you made sure she would not have to learn it the way you did. It looks like ordinary, boring, unremarkable Tuesday ordinary. That is the goal. Not triumph, not vindication. Ordinary. Ordinary is what I was fighting for all along. If you are listening to this, and you are counting right now the number of days since the last incident, the number of times you have told yourself it was not that bad, the number of reasons you are waiting before you leave, please hear me say this. You do not have to have 50 marks on your body to deserve help. You do not have to have video evidence. You do not have to have a Marine father who knows how to dismantle what someone built. You just have to make one phone call. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. It is free. It is confidential. They answer 24 hours a day, every day. The number is in the description of this video, along with a list of resources. We have personally verified legal aid, safety planning guides, shelter locations, financial help. If this story reached you today, it reached you for a reason. Call the number. Tell one person. Walk into one doctor's office and tell the truth. Because the door that feels locked from the outside, you are holding the key. You always have been. She finished the tea. She checked on Claire one more time, still sleeping. One sock mysteriously missing. A state of affairs that seemed to satisfy her deeply. She climbed into bed. Her bed, in her apartment. In her quiet, ordinary life. Before she turned off the light, she thought about the morning after, that Tuesday in October, standing in the kitchen, watching a car reverse out of the driveway, smiling because smiling was how she kept the morning safe. She thought about who that woman was and who she was now. They were the same person. That was the thing she wanted most for every woman who heard this story. Not to become someone different, not to need to become someone different, just to be allowed to be fully, safely, entirely the person you already were. She turned off the light. In the next room, Claire Calloway Mitchell slept on. 11 months old, one sock missing, completely unafraid, exactly as she was supposed to be.